Question?
So some level of protection I feel is necessary because if we open trade to all the industries, then there will be competition for all the industries that are there. So what level of protectionism is sort of optimal?
Good question. And I'm going to use that as a segue into the next topic because it is a perfect question that inspires what we're going to do next. Because as we've already seen, there are some circumstances where protectionism can be good from the national perspective. We saw that with a large country case, right? Large country putting a tariff into place could actually raise up its national welfare. The problem with that policy in that circumstance was that it came at the expense of the foreign country. The foreign country suffered losses when the large country puts an optimal tariff into place. What we're going to turn our attention to next, though, is that there are circumstances and there are times when protectionism can be warranted, where we can actually show that the country can be better off by putting protectionism into place. All right? And that inspires the next topic of discussion, and that is the topic of market imperfections, or sometimes they're called market failures. Let me give you a general overview of this topic first, and then we're going to look at some specifics. The models of trade that we've been looking at with respect to trade policy, we've been looking at tariffs and subsidies in particular, and we've been using a supply and demand curve. A supply and demand curve in both countries, we've been looking at the effects of these policies. Whenever you draw up a supply and demand curve and use it, we're assuming something about the market. We're assuming in particular that the market is perfectly competitive. Now, perfect competition, you may or may not remember from your previous economics classes, consists of a whole set of assumptions. And those assumptions are very, very particular, and they're designed in a way to make sure that we can say something definitive about the way markets work. But a couple of the things that it incorporates are things like there are many, many, many firms that are competing against each other. Each firm is so small that it can't influence the price that prevails in the marketplace. So we think about perfect competition as kind of like an agricultural industry, where there are millions of small family farms that are all supplying corn to a market in the national economy. Each individual farm could dry up and stop producing tomorrow. One farm isn't going to make any difference in what happens in the total market. That's the notion of a perfectly competitive market. It doesn't consist of big firms that can affect prices and can influence people through their decisions or through their advertising and things like that. It's not really a description of that kind of a market. So, and it also incorporates a certain number of implicit assumptions that are worth pointing out, and we're going to highlight a few of those assumptions here and think about what happens if we relax them or change them. Now, market imperfections, the term itself suggests the following. It means the following. Anytime we deviate away from the assumptions of perfect competition, we are in a world with market imperfections. So a market imperfection is something that's a deviation away from the standard assumptions of perfect competition. Now let me give you a couple of things that are characteristic of imperfections, some examples of them. The first and easiest one to understand is monopolies or oligopolies. A monopoly is one firm operating in a market. There is no competition with other firms. In that particular case, a monopoly would lower its quantity to the marketplace, raise up the price, gouge consumers, so to speak, and raise their profitability as a result of their single presence in the market. There is no competition. If we look at the welfare aspects of a monopoly relative to perfect competition, it's shown in most introductory courses or intermediate micro courses that you're actually reducing economic welfare for the society. Monopolies don't do good things for the economy. They do good things for themselves, but it's at the expense of consumers and the general welfare of the economy itself. If you have a monopoly in a market, or if you have a small number of firms, each of which are big enough to influence the price and they're competing against each other, we're outside of the world of perfect competition. And we can't describe the world with a supply and demand curve in quite the same way. We have to do things differently. So first deviation is If you've got monopolies or oligopolies in markets, you are no longer in a world of perfect competition. You need to change the analysis to see how things would work. A free trade might not always be the best policy if you've got monopolies or oligopolies in operation. Okay, second thing we're going to talk about, and this is the story we're going to talk about today, is what if unemployment arises in a particular sector of the market? Unemployed workers cannot occur in a perfectly competitive market. Unemployment means that there's an excess supply of labor relative to the demand for labor. And whenever that happens in a perfectly competitive market, what should happen is the wage should fall until the supply of workers is exactly equal to the demand for labor, for workers. So the wages should adjust upward and downward as needed in order to always eliminate any unemployment in the marketplace. Unemployment cannot exist in a perfectly competitive market. But we look at the real world, and we know that unemployment does exist. So clearly, the world markets do not conform to the standard assumptions of perfect competition always. If you've got unemployment, then all bets are off. Things can change. And we're going to take a look at that particular example in a trade context. Another example is externality effects. Perfect competition, without having said it, actually assumes that there are no external effects from the activities that firms and producers are engaging in. The classic example of an externality is pollution caused by either an industry or by a consuming group. An industry spews out emissions and pollutants into the air around it. That dirty air and that foul atmosphere affects people that are not necessarily consumers of this particular product that's being produced. It has negative impacts on others. If firms are left to their own devices, they are likely to spew out as much emissions as it's profitable for them to do so. If they do that, well, one of the assumptions of perfect competition is that there are no externality effects to worry about. And as a result of that, putting an externality into a model, like pollution, changes things. And it could mean that there's a role for policy to correct for that particular imperfection. So there are two types of externalities. There can be a positive externality or a negative externality. Pollution is a negative effect on others. But sometimes industries do good things, like do research and development. And sometimes the ideas they generate within a research and development and engineering section of a company actually spills over and generates new ideas in other industries as well. So positive external effects can occur as well as negative effects. And the point I want to make at this stage is just, if those things exist in a real world market, well then we're not in a world of perfect competition any longer. And we have the presence of market imperfections. Now, another area where imperfections arise is that some goods can be classified as being public goods. I'm just going to allude to this, and we're not going to spend too much time on this later because we don't have enough time. But a public good is a good that has two features. It's non-excludable and it's non-rival in consumption. National defense is the characteristic example of public good. Once defense is provided for a country, for example, to prevent invasions of outsiders or marauders from coming in and attacking us, once that's provided, everybody in the country is equally benefiting from that protection, from that security. All right, so you can't exclude somebody from the protection that's being offered. And if I feel secure because our borders are protected, then you can feel equally secure. My consumption of that security or safety isn't offset if you can enjoy it at the same time, in other words. That's what it means to be non-rival. Now, without going into the details, this is something you may have learned, should have learned in your previous econ classes. If goods have this characteristics, like national defense, markets don't do a very good job in providing for it at the optimal level. Intervention can make sense. The point I want to make here is that if goods have that public good characteristic, then we're not in a world of perfect competition any longer, and things would have to change. Now, public goods become an element of trade policy, because one of the arguments that's often used to support certain types of trade policies is exactly national security. right? We will argue we need to have sufficient agricultural production in the country because we don't want to be dependent on other countries if in a national emergency or if at a time of war we needed to provide food for our people. We don't want to have to rely on other countries, so we need to be self-sufficient or at least have a certain adequate production of certain commodities. That's basing a trade argument on the basis of a national security or the need to provide for a public good in a particular way. And that argument has some salience. It makes some sense in a trading context, and it could be a good justification. It is sometimes for protection for a particular country. Let's see what else. There's a bunch of other imperfections that can exist. One interesting one that we won't have time to explore is things like imperfect information. Perfect competition models generally assume that consumers and producers have everything they need to know in order to make the optimal decisions. But in the real world, perfect information isn't prevalent. It takes a lot of time and effort to get information you need in order to make good decisions. And in fact, that's what all of us, most of us in especially master's degrees are doing, is you're learning how to deal with, to accumulate information, to analyze it, to express it, to use it in order to foster the goals of certain organizations and certain companies. So you wouldn't have to do that if information was perfect. There'd be no need for anybody because snap your fingers, and maybe one day Google will provide this to us. Snap your fingers and you know everything you need to know. Why do you need to hire anybody? Just use Google. It's a dangerous thought, huh? Okay. So, in the presence of imperfections, we're not in a perfectly competitive world. Sometimes people call these market failures. I don't really like that term because it makes it sound like the market just stops working, it fails completely, there's no activity or action whatsoever. And that's not ever what happens. When these imperfections exist in markets, markets can still work. They just don't work optimally. And because they don't work optimally, there becomes ways in which governments could intervene in order to correct those imperfections and actually improve the welfare of a country. So that's exactly what we're going to talk about with a couple of examples. The unemployment example and the infant industry argument are both examples where, by implementing protection, tariffs at the border, even for a small country, you're going to be able to raise up the national welfare of the country and make the country better off. And in both of those instances, it's going to be because you're correcting for a market imperfection. You're recognizing that it exists, and you're taking it into account, and you're adjusting your policies to be suitable to that particular point or purpose. So, let's start walking through those particular examples. Okay, here's the story we're going to tell. Let's suppose we have a small country that imports a particular product in free trade. And let's imagine that the free trade price for this small country, we're looking at just one product, one market, so we're talking about coffee or something. And we're going to ask, well, what happens if the country is open to trade and it's a small importing country? Let's assume that the original price in the world is P1. Okay? The country will import D1 minus S1, the difference between demand and supply at that particular price, would generate a certain amount of well-being in the country as a result of those imports. Okay, that's our starting point. Step number 2. Suppose that there's a sudden drop in the international price. That drop in the international price might come about because, well, maybe a country is subsidizing production of something and there's a big increase in the natural or the produced amount of that product. Maybe there's a new discovery of a product. It could be some natural resource, like oil or gas. And we've discovered a new technology, like fracking, that will release a lot of gas and increase the supply to the particular market. So there could be a technology change that suddenly comes about. Or it could just be that kind of natural market forces came together to lead to an excess supply of a product in a particular point in time, and it caused a drop in the price of that product internationally. So we could ask, well, what would happen to this small importing country if it faced a sudden drop in the price for that product? So let's say the price dropped from P1 to P2. The first thing to note about what would happen is that would increase imports. Right? So imports would increase from D1 minus S1, that distance, the blue line, to the red line distance, D2 minus S2. So the effect of a drop in price would be to create an increase in imports. Now, if that increase in imports is substantial, and if it happens over a small amount of time, we could call it a surge of imports. So what we're telling here is a story in which it gets set off by a surge or sudden increase in imports from the rest of the world. Now, as a result of that surge of imports, we can look at the supply effect here in the domestic market and note that what that's going to do is it's going to drop domestic supply from S1 down to S2. The drop in supply also means, well, it means that the firms are not producing as much in that particular industry domestically. But if they're not going to produce as much because of the lower price, they're going to have to lay off some resources. And one of those important resources is workers. So the drop in supply from S1 to S2 corresponds in the background to a drop in employment in this particular industry. Now, suppose we live in a perfectly competitive market. And suppose this market is completely, perfectly competitive. In that case, we don't worry about the drop in supply of workers or the employment of workers in that industry, because in perfect competition, they're just going to get absorbed somewhere else in the economy, and they're going to be immediately reemployed somewhere else, because labor markets are always clearing. There's never any unemployment. So losing jobs in this sector just means somewhere else in the economy they're gaining jobs, and that's why we don't measure the loss in a perfectly competitive market setting. We just look at the changes in producer surplus. That's all we need to do. But what if they don't find another job? What if the market is not perfect for labor, and what if they can't make a transition to the other industry? What if their skill set is not ideal for the other industries where they're looking to hire workers at this point in time? And what if industries look at them and say, yes, you need a job, but I'm sorry, you don't have the skills we need. We're not going to hire you. Come back again in a year when you've developed the right skill set. So what if there is unemployment and these workers just can't get their jobs? Well, that would incur an economic cost. To them, it would also mean we're not producing as much total supply of goods and services because workers are unemployed. We're not using all of the available resources as best we can. And that unemployment has a cost that we could measure and evaluate. So let's look at the effect of this drop in price with that additional assumption thrown in and see what happens. Okay, we're going to take a look at the importing country welfare effects as a result of this surge of imports. And we could evaluate it this way. First of all, let's go back up here and say, what would happen to consumers as a result of the drop in the international price? They're going to be better off, right? And in fact, they're going to gain A, B, C, and D. They're going to expand their consumption. The price is going to be lower. They're all going to become better off. Spread out across a large group of people. Consumers are better off by A, B, C, D. Producers in the industry, in terms of just their surplus effect, they're going to lose area A because of the drop in price. And then there is no government effect that's taking place here, right? So because there's no government doing anything, that's the end of it. Surplus benefits to consumers, A, B, C, D. Losses to producers of A, that's the perfectly competitive analysis. Net effect of the surge of imports, all good. Net effect of plus B, C, D without the unemployment consideration that we just mentioned. If we just analyze this in a perfectly competitive world, we should invite surges of imports and be welcoming them. Now, we don't invite surges of imports, and in fact, we have a trade remedy law on the books you should be aware of. We talked about the Safeguards Act, and we talked about trade policies. Safeguards is an action that countries can take. It's WTO allowable. And if a country industry suffers a surge of imports and a sudden drop in price that affects their domestic industry and causes injury, then you can implement a tariff in response to that particular surge. And we might ask, is that a sensible policy or not? Now, if we stopped right here and did the perfectly competitive analysis, we would say, well, that's a stupid policy. Because, look, the surge is doing nothing but generating an improvement in national welfare. Yes, the firms are hurt. Yes, the workers lose their jobs, but don't worry, they're getting a job somewhere else. We should not have a policy that responds to surges of imports in that way by putting tariffs into place. But hold on. But what if if there's an unemployment effect. Now, how do we measure that unemployment effect? I don't know exactly. But what we want to do is we want to be able to come up with a dollar value of the costs that are being incurred because all of these workers in this industry have lost their job for some period of time from now into the future. Maybe it's going to be the lost income. Maybe it's going to be unemployment compensation that has to be paid by the government. Maybe it's going to be the anxiety and the dollar value of what it would take to eliminate the extra anxiety and household dysfunction that occurs because individuals have lost their jobs and they're uncertain about their future. Let's just imagine we could figure out what the value of that loss is to all of those workers, and let's assign a letter to represent that value. I'm going to call the value F. I don't know why I chose F. I just chose some letter. F. F is the unemployment cost. It's the sum total negative effects that are accruing on the workers who lose their jobs because of the surge that we've just identified in the previous example. And I'm going to call the unemployment cost, it's a cost, but I'm going to make it minus F to indicate that indeed there's a loss to the economy that arises because of the unemployment in that industry. And that might be long-lasting. It might not disappear. It might disappear in 6 months, but maybe it'll last for a long period of time if the workers really cannot be shifted into other sectors. Okay, so the national welfare effect, incorporating unemployment into the story, is not just BCD positive effect. It's going to be BCD minus F. And that means that the effect of the surge on national welfare could be positive, but it could be negative if that F value is big enough. The unemployment cost might be really burdensome. And if it is, we could argue that the surge is actually hurting the country rather than helping the country. And that's what happens when you incorporate an imperfection. The imperfection messes up the result and can give us a story where the surge is not so good for the country and might be something you'd want to react against. Okay, so let's imagine a reaction. The reaction would be implement a safeguards action. What if we put an import tariff into place and we wanted to eliminate the effects on the unemployed? We wanted to get rid of that unemployment. What could we do? Well, a tariff is a potential reaction in this case. So what do? We put a tariff into place, and let's say we want to put a tariff such that it will eliminate all of the unemployment that prevails in the market. Go back to the graph. The way to do that is to put a tariff into place that will raise production back up from S2 up to S1. And the way to do that in a small country case is put a tariff that will reinstate the original price. How do we get the price to rise up to P1? We put a tariff equal to P1 minus P2 into place. So let's do that. Let's put a tariff into place equal to the difference between P1 and P2 and restore the price that prevailed before the surge occurred. We can do that with a safeguards action. It's legal. WTO allows countries to do that. Let's do it, see what happens. Okay, here's the effects, but let's look at the graph and do it. Put the tariff into place. What is the change in consumer surplus as a result of that tariff being put into place? The answer is minus ABCD. Consumers lose the benefits they've gotten from the surge. That's the change. What's the effect on producers? Well, they benefit plus A. What's the effect on government? Because the government's now collecting a tax. The area C is the effect on government. So go down here. Minus ABCD effect on consumers, plus A on producers, plus C on government revenue and taxpayers. But there's an unemployment cost effect. And in this case, I'm putting a positive F because what we're doing is we're eliminating the negative effects and we're getting back to ground zero. The change is moving from minus F to 0. Therefore, the change is a plus F. You're getting those unemployed workers back to work and you're eliminating that negative effect upon the economy. So that's the positive effect we're representing with F. Now, the national welfare effect from the tariff turns out to be F minus B minus D. The deadweight losses are still there. Yes, the tariff causes deadweight losses. But it's eliminating the unemployment in the industry. So therefore, we've got a positive impact from the tariff, eliminating the unemployment, and we've got a negative impact. The efficiency losses caused by adjusting the prices in the marketplace. There's a trade-off between the two. Now, will the tariff improve national welfare? The answer is ambiguous, because it depends on the size of F in comparison to B and D. But what's interesting here is that F might well be larger than the sum of B and D together. And if F is bigger than B and D combined, then the tariff is going to actually increase the national welfare of the country because it corrects for the imperfection by a larger amount than the distortion caused by the tariff. And it might actually be that you could use trade policy to make the country better off rather than worse off. And this becomes one story amongst many where when you introduce imperfections into your models, suddenly trade policy is not always, free trade is not always the best policy. Free trade might not be the best policy in this particular circumstance. There's a lot more to this story, though. And I want to point out, so I've got 10 minutes or so, and I want to point out what else happens with this particular story. Because economists have known for a long time and have analyzed trade models and situations with imperfections going back to the 50s and even earlier than that. So the story that protection can raise welfare for a country is not something new. It's been around for a long time. And it's interesting to me to hear how everyone thinks economics tells us that free trade is the best policy, when theory tells us for half a century that free trade is not always the best policy, that it depends on the circumstances involved. And yet that message doesn't get transmitted quite as much. So free trade is not always the best policy. It depends on the circumstances. And one circumstance that can arise is market imperfections, which are prominent. They're everywhere. There are externalities. There is monopolies and oligopolies. There is unemployment that arises in markets. There are all of these imperfections in markets. The world is not perfectly competitive. So one thing we could jump to is to say, so it's obviously good that protectionism is good and we ought to have it because it can correct for stuff like this. Well, not so fast. There are some problems with this. First of all, I have not shown you that protection is good. I've only shown you that protection could potentially be good under a set of circumstances based on the measurements of benefits and losses that will arise because of this tariff. So we've introduced a problem, but we still don't know whether the unemployment effect is going to be larger than the deadweight loss effect, and that's likely to vary from industry to industry to industry and circumstance to circumstance. So you would have to do some measurement in order to find out whether that's truly valid and whether protection is a good thing or not. Now, economists have looked at this issue in the unemployment context and in a lot of other contexts. And they've done the following kind of comparisons. And if we had time, we could look at this in more detail, and the story would be more interesting. But I'm just going to have to allude to it because we don't have time to go through the analysis. But economists have looked at situations like this and asked, can trade policy improve welfare? And we see that the answer is potentially yes. Put a tariff into place in this circumstance, we might be able to raise up welfare for the country. But economists have asked something else, too. They've asked, is trade policy the best way to improve welfare in this particular circumstance? Or might there be some other policy that we could use that would correct for the unemployment problem better, that would do it more efficiently? So economists have done these exercises where we compare the tariff with another kind of a policy. Now, one policy you could use in this particular circumstance would be a domestic production subsidy. Again, we don't have time to go through the detailed effects of that production subsidy and how it differs from a tariff. So I'm just going to tell you what the result is. A production subsidy is a payment to the firms to produce more. So let's say a surge of imports has occurred, production is being cut by your domestic firms. One way the government could step in is just say, hey, tell you what, we're going to pay you a certain amount of money to produce this good, and if we pay you a certain amount, the firm will increase their production up to the level they were producing before. Now that's kind of a weird way to approach it maybe, and most politicians would never think, oh yeah, let's do that. But economists have thought about it and analyzed the effects of that in this kind of a market setting. and then discovered that, yes, that could work. If you subsidize production, you could increase firm production up to the level that they were at before. You could put the workers back to work. But the cool thing about the production subsidy turns out to be that you don't affect the price consumers pay. So when you put the tariff into place, the price goes up, and the consumers lose welfare because they have to pay higher prices for the products. With a production subsidy, you don't raise up the consumer price. The consumers get to enjoy the lower price that comes about with the surge. And instead, you're just adjusting what happens in the firm itself, the firms that are affected. Now, when you get closer to the firms and you affect them directly with a subsidy, it turns out that the economic effects of that policy are better than the economic effects of the tariff. Now, economists have then come up with some terminology that's useful for you to know. And that terminology is to compare the policies and to label them either a first best policy, the one that does the best job in raising welfare, or a second best policy, one that doesn't do quite as good. And what we've learned in our analysis of these kinds of comparisons is that trade, in this circumstance, turns out to be a second best policy. A tariff is not the best policy to use. So yes, it could work, potentially, but it's not going to be the best policy to use to correct for the unemployment problem in this particular circumstance. The production subsidy turns out to be better. And we could stop right there and say the production subsidy is first best, a trade policy, a tariff is second best. Therefore, if we were going to give policy advice to an administration, we would say, yeah, trade policy could be the way to go, but really you might want to think about a production subsidy instead, because that will do a better job. We'll be able to correct for the problem of unemployment at lower economic cost. Benefits will be spread out across we'll do better. It'll just be a better policy. First best, second best policies. Trade policy is second best. Now, we found this out in a lot of different circumstances with lots of different policies that make trade policy potentially beneficial for a market. Introduce oligopolies and monopolies and externality effects. We can find, put a trade policy into place that could raise up national welfare, make a country better off. Protectionism is good. But in almost every circumstance where we've looked at the effects of a trade policy and found it potentially beneficial, we can almost always come up with a situation where a domestic policy, like a production subsidy, is actually better. So one of the more sophisticated arguments that economists will use to support free trade is that we shouldn't try to correct for these imperfections by using trade policies. We could, but it's not going to be the best way to go because in most circumstances, trade policy is a second best policy. And other policies are more suited to correcting the particular problem at hand. Now, just a little bit more of generalization that economists have found across looking at this situation in many different models and many different situations. Because one of the questions that comes up, once you start to look at unemployment and think about first and second best policies, or you think about monopolies, think about first and second best policies, you think about pollution, think about first and second best policies, you start to say, hey, what is the nature of the first best policy always? So across all of these different situations, how do we identify what the first best, the most efficient policy would be? And there's actually an answer to that that's, I think, quite useful as a rule of thumb, and this can be applied in your life all over the place. The first best policy turned out to be the policy that targets the imperfection as directly as possible. You want to get right at the heart of what is the imperfection in the market, and you want to correct for that as close to the problem as possible. And if you can do that with a policy, that's going to be the most efficient policy to use. Attack the distortion or attack the imperfection as directly as possible. Now let's take that concept and apply it to this particular circumstance. And first ask, what is the imperfection? What is the problem? And there's likely to be some misinterpretation. Because the first thing, and what inspires our trade remedy law, the safeguards law really, is that we have identified with that law that the source of the problem is imports. And we're going to fight against imports by putting the tariff into place in this circumstance, and that's how we're going to correct the situation. So it's like the tariff is responding to the problem. And most people would say, what's the problem here? Why is the unemployment coming about? And they would say, the unemployment is coming about because of imports. So what's the best way to correct for that? Import tariff. Choke off imports, we solve the problem, unemployment is solved. That's what most workers will say. Let's raise up our tariffs against other countries. We're going to protect our industries, protect our jobs. That's going to be the best way to go. But it's not, because the problem isn't imports. In a perfectly competitive world, imports are a good thing for the economy. And the more imports we have, the better. The problem here is not imports. The problem is moving the workers from the industry that's contracting to the other industries. The way to see where you're supposed to get to, or what the best outcome is to find out what would happen in the perfectly competitive model, and then see how you could duplicate that as closely as possible. The imperfection I suggested at the beginning here is unemployment. That arises because of a sudden drop in the price, the workers are thrown out of work and they can't find another job. The problem is unemployment. That's what we're trying to correct for. Now, the production subsidy gets closer to the heart of the problem than the tariff does. Because the production subsidy says we're going to increase production and we're going to help you keep your job. But we're not going to affect consumers and their prices. We're not going to distort the prices too much elsewhere. We're just going to affect your job. Turns out, though, in this situation, that's not even the best way to go. Because of the following. In a perfectly competitive model, those workers would not keep their jobs in this industry. Instead, they would be moved into the next most productive industry, the ones in which we have a comparative advantage in. To try to keep these workers in this industry means we're trying to promote an industry in which we, for the moment, do not have a comparative advantage in. And we ought to be producing less. So, what would be the first best policy? First best policy would be a policy designed to move those workers as effectively and quickly as possible into other jobs to eliminate the unemployment. Because that would mimic the perfectly competitive outcome. Now, what kind of a policy could do that? Well, maybe it would involve some sort of a trade adjustment program. Maybe it would involve providing more skills, education, subsidies for education to the workers who are displaced from these jobs. Maybe it would involve matching workers more effectively with other jobs so that they lose their job. You know they're going to lose their job in this industry, but you're right there on the ground ready to say, but what about this job over here? This one might match. And you're trying to provide services to help them make the transition to other industries more effectively and more rapidly. Now that has a cost. Government has to pay to do that. But the cost of doing that, if you can do it effectively, and you can move these workers into other jobs, is going to come about at a lower cost, presumably, and that's what our analysis would suggest, than you would by trying to keep their jobs in that same industry. Because then you're going to have to keep them there indefinitely, even though the markets may change and we could lose our comparative advantage in that. So, first best policy, attack the imperfection as directly as possible. In this story, the imperfection is unemployment, so the corrective action to take and the best policy response by government would be, yes, devote resources not to a tariff, not to a production subsidy, but to some sort of policy that would more effectively move the workers from the declining industry into other industries. And that would be the first best policy. So we get a lot of lessons to be learned by digging deeper into this particular analysis and thinking hard about it. I've run out of time. We got through a lot today. Good. We're going to continue with this and talk about infinite industry arguments, and I'll give you another example of the same thing in another context, and you start to see the generality of this across different policies. So see you next time. Have a good week.